At 40 degrees below zero, you can throw a pot of boiling water into the air and watch it vanish before it ever hits the ground. It doesn't fall. It doesn't splash. It turns to snow in midair and drifts away like it was never water at all. That isn't a party trick. That is a job description, the working conditions of a northern winter, written in physics instead of words. In a place like that, wind doesn't blow. It cuts. It reaches past cloth and skin and pulls the heat straight out of a body, faster than that body can make it back. Snow throws the light back so completely that distance stops meaning anything, and the air, bone dry and far below freezing, takes moisture out of your lungs with every breath you draw. Survival there stops being a matter of comfort. It becomes a matter of arithmetic. Every movement spends something. Every breath costs something, and the ledger never forgives. And yet, across the frozen plains and the subarctic forests of North America, entire nations lived inside those conditions, not as an emergency, not as a season to be endured once and remembered forever, but as a life, generation after generation. Cree, Lakota, Blackfoot, Ojibwe. And they did it without metal that would fracture in the cold, without industry, without machines built to overpower the weather. They did it with something that looks, at first glance, almost insultingly ordinary: wood. But before any of them ever touched a tree, they did something else first, something no one wrote down, and something that had nothing to do with gathering. We'll come back to that, because it explains everything else. For now, picture a single moment. A man stands at the edge of the tree line in the last cold weeks before the thaw. He places his bare hand flat against the white bark of a birch and simply stays there. He has an axe. He has time. He does not cut. He is waiting for something, and until you understand what he's waiting for, none of the rest will make sense, because the forest was never scenery. It was a language, and these were the last people who could read it fluently. What he's waiting for is a window. For a few short weeks each year, as the sap begins to move and the tree wakes up, birch bark loosens from the wood beneath it and separates in clean, whole sheets. Come too early, and the bark won't give force it, and you wound the tree, maybe kill it. Come too late, and it tears into useless strips, a season's material lost for a season's impatience. That window is narrow, unmarked, and different every year. He isn't harvesting a tree, he's keeping an appointment. And he knows the date because he's been watching that same stand of birch since he was a boy. That's the part that gets missed. To him, the forest wasn't a place. It was a data set. Every species behaved in ways that could be predicted, repeated, and relied on. Birch peels in layers. Pine concentrates hard, dense heartwood, and bleeds resin when it's injured. Willow bends under stress instead of snapping. Cedar and spruce hold their shape and refuse to rot. Those weren't poetic observations. They were performance specifications, gathered over centuries of watching the same trees answer the same winters the same way. And birch was the crown of it. Its bark carries betulin, a compound that makes it stubbornly water-repellent, and volatile oils that will take a spark even when the whole world is soaked or frozen solid. That mattered more than it sounds. At 40 below, a failed attempt at fire isn't an inconvenience. Its core temperature you will never get back. Fire out there was never comfort. Fire was a countdown clock, and birch was the only thing that could stop it. None of this was written anywhere. It lived in the memory of the old, and it passed to the young not by being taught, but by walking beside them. But fire only opens the door to survival. It doesn't hold it open. Holding it open was pine's work. Where birch gives you a flame in seconds, pine gives you hours. Its heartwood grows tight and dense wood burns. Slowly the fire has to work its way inward, oxidizing at a rate the wood itself controls. That's not a violent heat, it's a patient one. And in a winter that lasts 6 months, patience is worth more than intensity every single time. But the greater gift wasn't the wood, it was the resin. Pine bleeds a thick amber sap when it's cut, loaded with antimicrobial compounds and high-energy hydrocarbons, and the people of the North found a use for nearly every property it had. It was glue, binding stone to shaft and bone to wood in composite tools. It was waterproofing, sealing the seams of moccasins and containers against melting snow. It was a protective coating that slowed the slow rot of constant exposure, and it was medicine smeared over a wound to seal it shut and keep it clean. That last one deserves a pause. In a world with no antibiotics, a small cut across the back of a hand in midwinter could kill a grown man, not from the bleeding. From what got into it 3 days later, when the swelling started and there was nothing left to do but wait. Pine resin was the nearest hospital, and it stood about 3 steps away. Then there was willow, which taught a different lesson entirely. In deep cold, rigidity is a weakness. Frozen materials fracture, and a fracture in the wrong place ends a journey. Willow survives because it bends its fibers, realign under heat and moisture, instead of failing, absorbing force, and springing back. So they built with it. Snowshoe frames that flexed under thousands of steps without cracking. Sled bindings that held tension through every jolt. Fish traps that gave with the current and kept their shape. And the snowshoe itself is applied physics, whether or not anyone ever wrote the equation. Spread a body's weight across a wider surface, and the pressure per square inch drops below the point at which snow collapses. Suddenly, ground that swallowed a man to the waist will carry him. Narrow frames were built for dense forest, where you need to slip between trees. Wide frames were built for the open plains, where wind-packed drifts demand maximum float. The tree taught them what people spend thousands of years relearning. Whatever refuses to bend is the first thing to break, so now they could move. But a man who can travel still needs somewhere to come back to. The shelters they came back to get called primitive, and that word does a lot of damage. Look at them as engineering, and they stop looking simple very quickly. The wiki-up curves, and that curve isn't decoration, it's aerodynamics, splitting wind around a dome instead of letting it slam into a flat wall, with layered bark packed over the frame to hold heat inside. The pit house goes the other direction, sinking partway into the earth to borrow the ground's thermal inertia, because soil a few feet down barely notices what the air is doing above it. And the Tipi turns its cone into a lung, drawing air up through the interior and out through smoke flaps that can be opened and closed as the wind shifts, so warmth and breathable air stay balanced against each other all night. 3 completely different structures, one identical principle. None of them fights the environment. Each of them finds a stable place inside it. Fire inside those walls was managed the same way as a system, not an event. Fuel came in tiers. Tinder first, birch bark, dry fungus, plant fibre, anything that would catch. Kindling second, cedar and willow twigs to carry the flame from fragile to steady. Then the primary fuel, pine and tamarack and hardwood, for the long hours. Stones were set around the hearth to soak up heat and give it back slowly through the night thermal batteries, made of nothing but rock and understanding. And ash was never swept away carelessly. Ash was insulation, banked over the coals so that morning began with embers instead of an empty pit and a fresh crisis. But none of that keeps itself. Someone had to stay awake. In every lodge, through the coldest hours, someone sat with the fire while the rest of the family slept, not out of fear, but because there were children in there, and elders, and people who wouldn't survive a night that went cold. The fire didn't stay alive on its own. It stayed alive because somebody chose not to sleep. And what that fire protected was more than warmth. Meat and fish were sliced thin, wind-dried in air too cold for bacteria, then smoked until they'd keep for months, and stored in birch bark containers that held out moisture and cold alike. Willow bark was chewed for pain. And it worked. It carries salicin. The compound modern chemistry would eventually refine into aspirin. Cedar smoke cleaned the air inside a sealed lodge where a dozen people breathed all winter. A system that complete can only exist if there's one rule nobody is allowed to break. Which brings us back to the thing they did before they touched a single tree. In the weeks before the cold closed in, they walked the forest and they walked it empty-handed. No axes swinging, no bundles carried home. They went to take inventory. Which trees had died and could be spent, which were struggling and had to be left alone, which stands had been drawn on too heavily last year and needed a season to come back. Winter didn't begin with a harvest, it began with a promise, and the rule underneath that promise was simple enough that a child could hold it, and serious enough that nobody broke it. Dead wood before living wood. Take only at the pace the forest can replace. Return the ash to the soil it came from. That isn't folklore. That's a feedback loop, human survival depending on the forest's continuity, and the forest's continuity depending on human restraint, which means the forest was never a resource, it was a partner, and a partner only works while the balance holds. They didn't survive the winter because they were tougher than it. They survived because they never asked the forest for more than it could afford to give. We have warmer houses now, better coats, and less ability to survive than they had because we stopped reading the thing that feeds us. This is where history isn't simplified. It's remembered. And far to the east, across a grey ocean, and far to the north, in a country that reaches 60 below, the Vikings and the Athabascans faced the exact same winter and answered it with something completely different.